Hands raw with effort, the axe bit into wood, driven by urgency. A storm threatened, and shelter was paramount. Alone against the wild, a man's survival depended on raising walls before nightfall. It demanded strength, instinct, unwavering focus, and an axe honed to a lethal edge. For in the wilderness, a sturdy cabin offered a lifeline. But how did the mountain men achieve this feat? How did they transform raw timber into enduring havens, quickly built and strong enough to withstand the elements? Let's uncover their methods. For centuries, the act of stacking logs has provided warmth, safety, and security. The log cabin's lineage predates the American frontier, its effectiveness long established. Its roots run deep in ancient Europe, where early peoples notched and interlocked logs. The Romans observed this technique, with even Vitruvius noting it. Yet Scandinavia and Eastern Europe perfected the craft, driven by the necessity of brutal winters for robust, weatherproof structures using only logs and notches, often without fasteners. This building tradition spread across Northern Europe and into Russia. Then came the wave of colonists. Swedish and Finnish settlers arriving in Delaware in 1638 brought this invaluable knowledge. The abundant forests provided the perfect resource. Without sawmills or formal plans, armed only with an axe and saw, they possessed the skill to turn trees into protective walls. Their cabins rose swiftly, born of labor and practical wisdom. Scots, Irish, and British settlers soon adopted the design. A lone individual could construct a basic cabin in a couple of months. With help, the main structure might stand within a week, though finishing took considerably longer. 4 walls and a roof were a declaration of presence, a claim staked in the vast wilderness. By the 1700s, log cabins were widespread, simple, resilient, and essentially free, requiring only effort and the land's bounty. For those pushing west, a cabin was more than shelter. It was a symbol of survival, asserting their place. Abraham Lincoln's birth in a humble Kentucky cabin in 1809 famously embodied this spirit, contributing to his image as a man of the people, trusted in a nation valuing grit. The Homestead Act of 1862 fueled further expansion, offering free land to those willing to build, farm, and settle. Wagons rolled westward, trees fell, and cabins materialized. These were not elaborate homes, but structures born of necessity. Logs, hard work, and the promise of a new beginning. Initially, they were rudimentary. A single room, dirt floor, one door against the cold, gaps stuffed with clay, stones, or rags. Times evolved. By the mid-1800s, sawmills eased timber preparation in settled areas, yet frontiersmen often still hand-hewed logs with axes and adzes for a smoother finish. In its earliest form, a cabin was merely a starting point, a temporary base while the land was worked. Some expanded, many did not. A roof, warmth, and food were often sufficient. The Scotch-Irish style often dictated a simple 16-20-foot, one-room design with opposing doors and a stone hearth. Pioneers simplified this further: stacked logs, mud chinking, and a quickly lit fire. As communities grew, cabins became more refined. The dog trot featured 2 rooms separated by a covered breezeway, offering cool ventilation. The saddlebag offered 2 rooms under one roof with a central chimney, often including a loft and porch. By the mid-1800s, even the affluent appreciated their rustic charm, using them as retreats. The Adirondack style marked a shift towards comfort and grandeur with high peaks and substantial beams. But for the true frontiersman, the cabin remained a testament to resilience, a defiant stand against the wild, proof of belonging. Before any place could be called home, it had to be wrested from the wilderness, often shaped by one's own hands, starting with a log cabin, efficient, durable, built from the immediate surroundings. The process began with clearing land, felling trees, removing roots, creating space. Every tree served a dual purpose, clearing ground and providing building material. But not just any tree. Straight sound trunks were needed. Pine, cedar, fir, lodgepole, species less prone to twisting, rot, or cracking. Felling was best in fall and winter. Spring-cut logs peeled easier but dried poorly and split, while warm weather attracted destructive insects. Cold-season timber held strong. Once cut, logs were stripped of bark, notched at the ends, and carefully stacked. Done correctly, they interlocked tightly, providing formidable resistance to wind, rain, and cold. A cabin served fundamental purposes, providing shelter, deterring wildlife, retaining heat, and offering a place for practical necessities by firelight. Often, it was basic: a single room, dirt floor, one door. But as circumstances allowed, additions followed. A loft, another room, a porch to observe the land shaped by one's labor. Proper drying was crucial. Peeled logs stacked on skids ideally needed 6 months to cure without rotting. But urgency often meant working with green logs, anticipating shrinkage and planning for extra chinking later. The straightest logs were prioritized, curved ones integrated carefully. The aim was always a tight, level fit. The thickest logs formed the base walls to support the load. Construction proceeded by raising all walls simultaneously, log by log, to maintain balance. Inside dimensions were primary, outside measurements varying with log thickness. The corners were the cabin's anchors, holding the structure together. The round notch was a preferred method, securely interlocking each log without nails or pegs, though wooden pegs were sometimes added for stability. A lone builder typically stopped walls at 6 feet, or as high as they could lift. With help, they could go higher, allowing for a loft or more. Most cabins measured 12 to 16 feet per side, small enough to heat effectively, large enough to live in. When the final log was set, the wilderness began to feel like home. With walls and roof complete, the crucial task of sealing began. Gaps between logs admitted wind, rain, and cold. Chinking, mud, or clay packed firmly into every crevice sealed the interior. It wasn't refined, but it worked. And consistently, the cabin's enduring strength lay in its corners, where the structure locked together, standing firm against the trials of time and weather. Many frontiersmen particularly favored the saddle notch, a joint prized for its strength, snug fit, and ability to shed water, crucial for preventing rot. Unlike cuts made into both logs, the saddle notch involved shaping only the underside of the upper log. This simple design directed rain outward, preventing pooling, and as the wood dried and contracted, the notch tightened, keeping walls sealed and the cabin structurally sound through changing seasons. A skilled individual could fashion this notch with just an axe, though tools like chisels or saws certainly eased the process. Cabin construction began with the base logs, 2 laid lengthwise, 2 crosswise. These foundation logs were squared and flattened on their undersides to ensure stable seating. Once positioned, they were often pinned together with wooden pegs, dog dowels, to prevent shifting. Then came the first saddle notches. When executed properly, the logs settled together almost seamlessly, a solid, weather-resistant start. To create the notch, the upper log was marked, then flipped to expose its underside. A sharp axe removed the bulk of the wood, and a chisel, if available, refined the curved shape. The goal was a cut deep enough that the weight of the log above would bear down on the edges of the notch, creating a tight, locking fit. Each subsequent log underwent the same process. To enhance the fit further, builders sometimes slightly widened the notches, forcing the logs to settle and compress against each other as the structure aged. A well-cut saddle notch truly was fundamental to the cabin's integrity. A poorly cut one led to twisted walls and large gaps, while a well-crafted one ensured resilience against wind, cold, and time. Think of the cabin as a system of weight and balance, with the corners providing the essential stability. Other notching styles existed, such as the dovetail, which also effectively shed water with its angled appearance resembling a shingled roof. Box corners offered squared-off durability, while plain tenons relied solely on gravity. Each had its place, but a poor choice or execution inevitably led to future problems. Once the walls were taking shape, framing for doors and windows became necessary. Grooves cut into the back of these frames allowed them to interlock with the logs, while the front could be simple or rabbeted to serve as a doorstop. Critically, because logs shrink significantly as they dry, builders left several extra inches of space above openings and at corners. Failing to account for this shrinkage would result in jammed doors, cracked window frames, and a loosened structure. But done correctly, these details ensured the cabin remained stable and secure, a genuine fortress against the wilderness. Next came the floor joists, forming the subfloor's support. These were often set into notches carved into the lower wall logs, or supported by a stone foundation if available. Either way, they needed to be robust, level, and firmly fixed. Builders could notch them directly into the side logs or flatten a section of the interior wall logs for support. If using round pole joists, 4 or 8 inches thick, the tops were typically hewn flat to provide a stable base for laying the floorboards. Every log needed to fit snugly. No gaps, no wobbles. The corners had to remain level, often checked against the floor joists. If a log sat too high, its notch was deepened. If one end was thicker, the log might be flipped for better balance. While sometimes rough logs were flattened on the underside for a tighter seal, the constant aim was straight, plumb walls. Lacking modern levels, mountain men relied on a plumb bob, a weight on a string, or a straight board combined with a practiced eye to ensure everything was true. To anchor the walls once stacked, they were secured with wooden pins or, less commonly in the deep wilderness, iron spikes. Wooden pins, often made from tough, cured hardwoods like oak or hickory, were driven through pre-drilled holes, allowing the logs to settle naturally over time. The majority of cabins relied on the strength of saddle or dovetail notches combined with these wooden pegs. Iron spikes were much rarer for frontiersmen, more often found in settled areas. Early cabins were inherently dim. Windows were kept small for security and heat retention. Instead of glass, materials like greased paper or oiled cloth were used, and sometimes even stretched rawhide, though this was less common. Openings were roughed out first, with final shaping done only when the frames were ready to ensure a tight fit. Markings on the logs guided the cutting process as walls rose. Cutting across a log for a window or door required precision. If a log split, its loose ends needed immediate support to prevent the wall from shifting out of alignment. Mountain men didn't improvise windows and doors. They planned them from the start. As walls were stacked, planned opening locations were marked, and corner logs were notched accordingly. When the time came, openings were created using a broad axe or adze. If a saw was available, it might be used to clean up the cut, but often, the accuracy of the axe swing was sufficient. To prevent the walls from buckling around openings, Sturdy, thick timber frames were essential to hold the logs steady as the cabin settled. Recognizing that logs would shrink, builders deliberately left a small gap above each opening. Without this foresight, doors would bind, windows could crack, and the entire structure's integrity would be compromised. The frames themselves were typically rough-hewn timber, secured with pegs or nails if on hand. Doors were often crafted from split logs, fastened with wooden dowels or simple rawhide hinges. The small gap left above openings was later packed with materials like moss, oakum, or wood shavings to block drafts while allowing the logs to settle naturally without stressing the frames. Even the tightest walls, best chinking, and strongest corners were meaningless if the roof failed. A leaky roof could transform a cabin into a freezing, miserable place during winter. A good roof began with readily available materials. While sawn lumber might be found in settlements, frontiersmen primarily used hand-split shakes, bark, or overlapping logs. The top wall logs were often flattened or notched to properly seat the roof rafters. Some cabins featured gable ends constructed of stacked logs for a uniform appearance, while others used timber framing covered with shakes or rough planks. Hand-split shakes were the standard frontier roofing material, cleaved from straight-grain cedar, pine, or other suitable woods. While sawn shingles could be traded for if one had the means, most split their own, a demanding task. Logs were cut into short sections and split using a froe, a long blade struck with a wooden maul. Each blow separated a thick, uneven shake, typically around 3/4 of an inch thick, far more substantial than factory shingles, as tough as the log walls below. Overhangs were functional, not just aesthetic, helping to direct rain away from the walls and allowing snow to slide off. Roof beams, crucial for support, ran across the top logs, usually spaced about 2 feet apart, sometimes doubled for extra strength. Gable logs interlocked with the roof structure for stability. Lacking modern steel flashing, pioneers relied on tight joins, overlapping shakes, and filling remaining gaps with moss or clay. A roof not built soundly would reveal its flaws in the first storm, and in the wilderness, a leak could be deadly. While a roof made of hand-split shakes might allow slivers of light to penetrate from within, if laid correctly, it provided essential protection from rain. Out here, metal was scarce. Wood, skillfully installed, was the primary defense against harsh weather. Most cabins were single-room dwellings, but some frontiersmen required more space. To add an extra room, a man had a couple of options. He could extend the structure by stacking logs and notching them tightly at the corners, just like the outer walls. Alternatively, if lumber was available, he could build a framed partition wall. This lighter wall was supported between the log walls, but never rigidly attached to them. This was crucial because logs settle and shrink over time, and anything fastened across them would eventually twist or tear itself apart. Regarding ceiling gaps, some building traditions, particularly in Scandinavia, utilized chinkless construction, where logs were meticulously scribed to fit so precisely that no filler was needed. However, the demands of frontier survival didn't afford such time-consuming precision. A mountain man didn't have weeks for perfect joinery. He needed shelter operational before winter set in. This necessity drove the widespread use of quick, sturdy saddle notches or simple dovetails, fast enough to build, robust enough to hold. A cabin without a fireplace was barely a cabin at all. Without one, winter's grip was immediate and deadly. Freezing before morning was a real threat. Fire was the source of warmth, illumination, and the means to cook, the undeniable heart of any frontier home. Many frontiersmen began by constructing their fireplace, stacking rough stone at one gable end before raising the log walls around it. Stone was chosen for its fire resistance, durability, and its ability, once heated, to radiate warmth long after the fire died down. Some built double-thick walls for enhanced heat retention. The hearth was made wide and deep enough for cooking and efficiently heating the room. The foundation was dug below the frost line to prevent ground heaving from cracking the chimney structure. As with the cabin walls, gaps between the timber and stone were sealed tight with chinking materials like mud, moss, or clay to block drafts. In the wilderness, lacking modern inserts or heat chambers, the thick stone mass itself was the primary heat battery. Once the fireplace stood and the logs were stacked around it, a frontiersman might take measures to protect his completed work. On the exterior, he might rub bear grease or certain animal fats into the wood to offer some resistance against rain and rot. Others relied more heavily on selecting naturally durable logs and ensuring generous roof overhangs for protection. It was never perfect. Nothing out here was. But these simple preventive steps could mean the difference between a cabin that endured only a few harsh seasons and one that lasted for generations. The interior of a newly built cabin was Spartan. It typically contained just a table, a bed, and perhaps a stool if time allowed. There was no room for clutter or non-essentials. Every item served a purpose. If furniture was needed, it was built by hand from the same trees used for the cabin walls. Sturdy pole pine out west, oak or hickory back east, or whatever durable wood was readily available. First, the bark was stripped from the logs, leaving it on retained moisture and harbored insects. Once debarked, the wood could be shaped into simple beds, stools, and tables. Refined finishes were not a concern. For preservation, bear fat or whatever animal fat was on hand might be rubbed into the wood. Beeswax, linseed oil, or pine tar were also used but were less common. The inherent rot resistance of the chosen logs was often the most important factor. Chairs and stools were simple, but built for toughness. Legs were securely wedged, cross-braced, or joined with wooden dowels for stability. If a chair failed, the fault lay not with the wood, but with the builder's skill. Benches, too, were roughly cut and strong, made from woods like pole pine, birch, or tamarack, joined using wooden pegs or tight notching. No glue, no screws, just solid wood interlocking. A bed was often the simplest piece, 4 posts supporting wooden slats or a taut rope lattice. Bunks followed the same principle, built strong without wasted effort. Mattresses, if available, were typically stuffed with straw, feathers, or dried grass. Every mountain man needed a place for his equipment. A wooden chest served for storing supplies, sometimes supplemented by a simple shelf if time permitted. Pine or tamarack worked well, cut and fitted tightly with wooden dowels or hand-forged nails. Firewood was kept in basic stacks or wooden bins, side joints pegged, not bolted. If an item needed a handle, it was carved from wood. On the frontier, practicality governed every choice. A mountain man's first swing of the axe marked the start of his home, his last act of securing it, a declaration of his place on the land forever. Step into the past with us, to an era when the wilderness reigned supreme and survival was an art form. Today, we're delving into the lives of the American frontier's most iconic figures, the mountain men. These weren't just characters from history books. They were the embodiment of self-reliance, resilience, and a profound connection to the environment. Their very existence hinged on their ability to understand the subtle signals of the wilderness, and this skill was nowhere more evident than in their crucial decision of where to build their cabins. Imagine yourself a solitary figure, hundreds of miles from civilization, with only your wits and your gear. The choice of a cabin site wasn't a whim. It was a strategic imperative, a calculated gamble against the unforgiving elements, hostile encounters, and the relentless demands of survival. They didn't have architects or real estate agents. They had their instincts, their experience, and an intimate knowledge of nature's every whisper. So how did they do it? What ancient wisdom guided their hands as they selected the very ground upon which they'd stake their lives? Let's delve deep into the lost art of mountain man cabin placement, uncovering the layers of foresight and practicality that shaped their homes in the wild. The paramount pillars: shelter, security, and sustainability. At its very core, every decision a mountain man made about his cabin site revolved around a critical triumvirate of needs: shelter, security, and sustainability. These weren't merely conveniences. They were absolute non-negotiable requirements for survival in an unforgiving landscape. To compromise on any one of these pillars was to invite hardship, danger, and often failure. First, let's delve into shelter. The American West, while breathtakingly beautiful, was also a land of meteorological extremes that could turn deadly in an instant. Imagine the brutal bite of a Rocky Mountain blizzard, burying landscapes under feet of snow, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing. Or consider the scorching, relentless sun of a summer desert, baking the earth and sapping strength. Then there were the sudden, violent thunderstorms that could unleash torrential rain, hail, and terrifying winds. A flimsy structure, poorly constructed, or more critically, poorly placed, simply wouldn't offer the necessary protection. The cabin had to be a bastion against these forces, a sanctuary where precious body heat could be retained, gear could be kept dry, and the weary body could truly recover from the day's arduous demands. It was a place to thaw frozen fingers, dry soaked clothing, and find respite from nature's relentless assault. Without adequate shelter, a mountain man's strength would wane, his health would falter, and his ability to hunt and trap would quickly diminish. Next, we address security. The wilderness, while a source of abundant resources, was also a domain of inherent dangers. This wasn't just about encounters with formidable predators like grizzly bears or wolves, though those were certainly real threats. It was also about the human element. The frontier was a wild tapestry of diverse groups, rival trappers fiercely protecting their trapping grounds, various indigenous tribes with whom relationships could range from friendly trade to outright conflict, and outlaws or desperate individuals seeking to prey on isolated figures. A cabin had to offer more than just walls. It needed to be a defensible position. This meant having clear lines of sight to detect approaching threats, the ability to conceal oneself or one's movements, and a structure stout enough to withstand potential attack. Often the best defense was not being found at all, making concealment as vital, if not more so, than overt fortification. A mountain man understood that his cabin was both his home and his last line of defense. Finally, we arrive at sustainability. A mountain man was entirely self-reliant, living off the bounty of the land. His cabin couldn't be a drain on his limited energy or the surrounding resources. It had to be strategically positioned to facilitate his survival and his livelihood. This meant immediate and consistent access to everything he needed: a reliable source of clean water for drinking and cooking, abundant game trails and trapping grounds for food and furs, and a readily available supply of timber for building, repairs, and most crucially, fuel for his life-saving fire. A site that required constant, arduous treks for basic necessities would quickly lead to exhaustion, inefficiency, and ultimately, failure. Every day was a calculation of energy expended versus resources gained. A sustainably chosen site minimized the former and maximized the latter, allowing the mountain man to thrive, or at least endure, in the challenging environment. These three pillars, shelter, security, and sustainability, formed the bedrock of every successful cabin choice. They weren't just criteria on a checklist. They were intertwined principles that dictated the very possibility of survival in the untamed American wilderness. A mountain man's life depended on understanding and mastering this fundamental relationship with the land. Topography. Reading the Earth's embrace. The very first and arguably most intuitive lesson a mountain man learned, often through hard-won experience, was how to read the land. Topography, the study of the arrangement of the natural and artificial physical features of an area, wasn't an academic discipline to them. It was a living, breathing language, a detailed map etched into the very surface of the earth. The subtle undulations, the gentle slopes, the sharp rises, and the hidden depressions all told a crucial story, a narrative of wind patterns, water flow, snow accumulation, and natural protection. Mastering this language was paramount to choosing a truly viable and survivable cabin site. Mountain men invariably sought out natural depressions, hollows, or most commonly, the leeward side of hills and ridges. To understand why, imagine a fierce winter wind, a true blizzard, whipping mercilessly through a valley. A cabin perched exposed on a prominent ridge or in an open, flat expanse would be relentlessly blasted by these gale-force winds. This exposure wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would be catastrophically inefficient. Heat would be stripped from the cabin at an alarming rate, forcing the occupant to expend precious firewood and energy just to stay warm. Furthermore, the constant stress of the wind would weaken the cabin's structure over time, leading to potential damage and vulnerability. In stark contrast, a cabin nestled into the curve of a hillside, or tucked directly behind a natural rise or a sturdy ridge, would be remarkably shielded. The earth itself would act as a massive natural windbreak, deflecting the harshest currents up and over the dwelling. This wasn't merely about comfort, it was about the profound physics of thermal regulation. The land, embracing the cabin, would provide a significant insulating blanket. The ground temperature, even in winter, is often higher than the ambient air temperature, and burying or backing a cabin into a slope leverages this thermal mass to maintain warmth and drastically reduce heat loss. This clever placement minimized the amount of firewood needed, conserving a vital resource and reducing daily labor. Beyond wind protection, they possessed an almost intuitive, ingrained understanding of solar orientation. A gently sloping, south-facing site was consistently one of the most highly prized characteristics of any potential cabin location. The reasoning is elegantly simple. In the Northern Hemisphere, a south-facing exposure maximizes sunlight throughout the day, particularly during the shorter, darker, and colder days of winter. This natural passive solar heating would significantly contribute to keeping the cabin warmer without expending additional fuel. Sunlight penetrating the cabin during the day would warm the interior, and even subtle warming of the exterior logs would make a difference. More sun also meant less persistent snow accumulation directly around the immediate vicinity of the cabin, offering easier movement, reducing dampness, and melting ice more quickly. All subtle but critical advantages in a harsh environment. They harnessed the sun's power for warmth and light long before modern science articulated the principles of passive solar design. Furthermore, reading the topography meant understanding drainage patterns. A low-lying area, while offering some wind protection, might also be a natural basin for water accumulation during heavy rains or spring thaws. Mountain men were acutely aware of the dangers of dampness, flooding, and the health issues they could bring. Thus, they would typically choose sites on slightly elevated ground within a sheltered area, ensuring good natural drainage away from the cabin foundation. This foresight prevented saturated ground, structural rot, and perpetually damp conditions inside their living space. In essence, the mountain man's understanding of topography was a holistic comprehension of how the Earth's features interacted with the elements. It was an art of seeking the most favorable microclimate, a natural wisdom that allowed them to become one with the landscape, finding both sanctuary and strategic advantage within its embrace. Water, the irreplaceable artery of life. If topography was the skeleton, water was the very blood of the frontier. Without a reliable, accessible source of clean water, no cabin site, no matter how perfect in other respects, was viable. Mountain men prioritized sites near clean, flowing streams, consistent springs, or well-protected ponds. Stagnant water was a breeding ground for disease, something they couldn't afford. A spring, bubbling up from the earth, offered a constant supply of fresh, cold water, often untouched by surface contaminants. This was the gold standard. However, simply being near water wasn't enough. The site had to be elevated slightly above the water source. This was a crucial defense against flooding, particularly during the powerful spring thaws when swollen rivers and streams could engulf everything in their path. An elevated position also aided in sanitation, preventing runoff from the cabin or camp area from contaminating their primary water supply. The ease of access was also paramount. Hauling heavy buckets of water over long distances or treacherous terrain was a daily chore they sought to minimize. A cabin often stood a mere stone's throw from a pristine, babbling brook, its gentle murmur a constant reminder of life's essential rhythm. Resources, the bounty of the wild. A mountain man's existence was one of constant resource management. His cabin site had to be a nexus of vital supplies. Timber was the most immediate requirement, not just for constructing the cabin itself, but for repairs, extensions, and, most critically, as fuel for fire. Winters in the mountains were unforgiving, and a constant, abundant supply of firewood was non-negotiable. They sought out healthy, mature forests nearby, but not so dense that they blocked out too much light or became impossible to navigate. Ideally, the timber would be easily felled and transported. They knew the best types of wood for burning, for structural integrity, and for crafting tools. Beyond timber, the presence of game was a make-or-break factor. Deer, elk, buffalo, beaver, and a myriad of smaller animals were their sustenance and their livelihood. They would look for animal trails, natural watering holes, mineral licks, and areas known for seasonal migrations or preferred grazing grounds. A well-chosen site would place them squarely within easy hunting and trapping range, ensuring a consistent supply of food and the valuable furs that were their currency. They understood the seasonal movements of animals and often had multiple, smaller trapping shelters strategically placed throughout their territory. And while meat was the dietary staple, forage provided essential variety and nutrients. Mountain men understood the seasonal availability of wild berries, roots, nuts, and edible plants. A diverse flora around the cabin site could supplement their diet and provide crucial medicinal resources. They were botanists by necessity, knowing which plants were safe, which were useful, and which were dangerous. Defense and concealment. The art of disappearing. In the untamed American frontier, survival wasn't merely about resilience against nature. It was equally about constant vigilance against potential threats from both man and beast. For the mountain man, his cabin was not just a home, it was a potential target, a visible sign of his presence, and thus, a critical element in his defensive strategy. Consequently, defense and concealment were not luxuries or afterthoughts. They were vital, life-or-death considerations that profoundly influenced the choice of every cabin site. A mountain man's cabin was rarely, if ever, built in a prominent, exposed location. They intuitively understood the principle of invisibility through integration. Their goal was to make their dwelling as inconspicuous as possible, to blend it seamlessly into the surrounding landscape, effectively making it disappear to the casual observer. This meant seeking out natural cover, dense stands of mature trees, towering rock outcrops, deep ravines, or the subtle folds of terrain that provided both visual obstruction and tactical advantage. A cabin tucked into a thicket of pines or nestled against a massive granite boulder would be incredibly difficult to spot from a distance, deterring casual discovery by curious or hostile parties. This proactive concealment was often the first and most effective line of defense, preventing a confrontation altogether. Beyond mere visual concealment, mountain men were masters of strategic positioning for tactical advantage. They meticulously considered lines of sight, not just what they could see, but what could be seen of them. A good cabin site offered a clear, unimpeded view of approaching trails, waterways, or any likely avenue of access. This panoramic surveillance allowed them to spot potential threats long before they arrived at the cabin, giving them precious time to prepare. This preparation might involve grabbing their rifle, extinguishing their fire, moving to a better defensive position, or simply melting away into the surrounding wilderness. The element of surprise was a powerful weapon, and they sought to ensure it was always on their side. Furthermore, the physical structure and its immediate surroundings were often integrated into a defensive scheme. Sometimes a cabin would be built directly against a massive boulder, a sheer rock face, or a steep, unscalable bank. This provided a natural, impenetrable wall on one side, effectively reducing the number of vulnerable approaches the mountain man had to defend. It also conserved labor, as one wall was pre-built by nature. Entrances were often small, easily barricaded, and positioned to offer a narrow firing arc outwards. Windows, if present at all, were usually small, high, and designed more for observation than light, minimizing exposure. They also thought about how sound might travel. A cabin near a noisy stream, for instance, might offer acoustic concealment, masking the sounds of movement within the cabin or even the sound of an approaching individual. Conversely, a site that allowed the mountain man to hear approaching game or humans from a distance, without being heard himself, was invaluable. In essence, the mountain man's approach to defense and concealment was a highly evolved form of environmental intelligence. It was about leveraging every natural feature, the lay of the land, the density of the foliage, the presence of rock formations, to create a home that was both a sanctuary and a fortress. They didn't just build cabins. They crafted havens that whispered their presence only to those they chose to reveal it to, embodying the true art of disappearing into the vast, wild embrace of the frontier. Escape routes. The prudent path to survival. Even the most meticulously planned defense could fail. A truly astute mountain man always had a plan B, a clear and viable escape route. This foresight was a testament to their deep-seated understanding of risk and their unwavering commitment to self-preservation. Their cabin sites were frequently chosen with multiple avenues of retreat in mind. This might be a hidden, narrow trail leading directly into dense, impassable woods, a swift, downhill path to a river where a canoe or raft could be hidden, or a strategic climb up a steep, difficult slope that would deter pursuit. They never wanted to be cornered, never wanted to be left with no options. This proactive thinking, this constant awareness of potential peril, was what often separated the survivors from those who succumbed to the harsh realities of the frontier. They moved with the land, ready to become one with it again at a moment's notice. So, the next time you envision a lone, rugged cabin nestled in the heart of the mountains, remember it's far more than just a collection of logs. It's a testament to incredible foresight, an enduring monument to human ingenuity in the face of raw nature. It's a masterclass in reading the environment, a perfect synergy of shelter, security, and sustainability. These silent sentinels of the past stand as powerful reminders of an era when connection to the land wasn't a choice, but the very essence of life itself. The mountain men didn't just build homes. They wove themselves into the very fabric of the wilderness, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and a profound understanding of what it truly means to master the land. What aspects of mountain man's survival do you find most fascinating? Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into frontier wisdom, please hit that like button, subscribe to Era of the Greats for more journeys into the wild, and make sure to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and stay connected to the wild spirit within. Today, we're embarking on a journey back in time, to an era when self-reliance wasn't a hobby, but a way of life. We're talking about the legendary American mountain men, iconic figures who carved out an existence in the unforgiving wilderness. These weren't just rugged individuals, they were master naturalists, skilled craftsmen, and primal engineers. Their very survival hinged on their ability to read the land, understand its dangers, and build shelters that could withstand everything Mother Nature and sometimes human adversaries threw at them. Forget modern building codes or a trip to Home Depot. Their tools were axes, their knowledge was hard-won experience, and their stakes were incredibly high. So what separated the seasoned trapper, who lived to tell tales around the campfire, from the unfortunate soul whose wilderness dream turned into a tragic reality? More often than not, it came down to avoiding some critical and often deadly mistakes in the most fundamental task of all: building their cabin. These weren't just errors in construction. They were errors in judgment that could spell the difference between life and death. Join me as we uncover the top 5 deadly mistakes mountain men never made when building their cabins. Understanding these isn't just a fascinating look at history, it's a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and the ancient wisdom of living in harmony, and sometimes defiance, of the wild. Let's dive in. Deadly mistake. 5. Ignoring the lay of the land. The fatal foundation. The first and arguably most foundational mistake a smart mountain man always avoided was building without meticulously scrutinizing the terrain. This wasn't about finding the prettiest view. It was about sheer, unadulterated survival. A wrong location could lead to immediate peril or a slow, agonizing demise. Imagine the wilderness in early spring after a heavy winter snowfall. Rivers swell, and frozen ground begins to thaw. If a cabin was carelessly nestled in a low-lying area, particularly too close to a rapidly swelling river or a seasonal stream bed that became a raging torrent during runoff, it was an open invitation for disaster. That once tranquil, babbling brook could transform into a furious, muddy flood, easily sweeping away a poorly sited cabin, its precious contents, and, most importantly, its inhabitant. Experienced mountain men instinctively knew to look for higher ground, places that were naturally elevated, offering crucial protection from flash floods and prolonged dampness that could undermine the cabin's very structure. They'd observe subtle environmental cues, the telltale watermarks on trees, the erosion patterns on riverbanks, or even how snow melted and water flowed across the landscape to identify safe, elevated zones that remained dry even during peak water events. Then there was the ever-present danger posed by the mountains themselves. In steep, unforgiving terrain, building at the base of an unstable slope or directly below a sheer cliff face was pure folly. A sudden earthquake, a prolonged thaw, or even just continuous heavy rainfall could trigger devastating avalanches or rock slides, burying a cabin and its occupant under tons of snow, ice, or stone in a matter of seconds. The wise mountain man would choose sites with natural protection, perhaps a small, protective ridge, a gradual slope that wouldn't pose such a direct threat. Or they'd ensure their cabin was securely built on solid, exposed bedrock foundations that offered inherent stability against such forces. They were acutely aware that nature's destructive power could be sudden and overwhelming. Even on seemingly flat ground, drainage was a paramount concern. A cabin built on damp, poorly draining soil would slowly but surely rot from the bottom up. Standing water around the foundation would invite rapid decay of the bottom logs, compromise the entire structural integrity over time, and create a perpetually cold, damp, and unhealthy living space that fostered disease and misery. These men understood the subtle contours of the land, identifying natural depressions or slight inclines that would effortlessly shed water away from their dwelling, preventing accumulation. They were, in essence, self-taught geologists and hydrologists in buckskin, capable of reading the land's secrets. Their patience in scouting a location was legendary. They would often spend days, sometimes even weeks, observing the land, studying its microclimates, analyzing prevailing wind patterns, and identifying any potential hazards before ever felling a single tree. This critical first step, though time-consuming, quite literally laid the groundwork for their survival and the longevity of their vital shelter. Deadly mistake number 4. Skimping on the foundation, the root of all rot. You've heard the saying, a house is only as strong as its foundation. For a mountain man, this wasn't just a quaint proverb or a building industry standard. It was a life-or-death engineering principle directly tied to the cabin's longevity and their personal safety. The 4th deadly mistake they absolutely sidestepped was building directly on the bare ground or employing an inadequate, uneven, or hastily constructed foundation. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic failure like an avalanche, but a slow, insidious killer, leading to inevitable structural collapse, chronic discomfort, and vulnerability. Placing raw, untreated logs directly on damp earth is the quickest and most assured way to invite a host of destructive forces. First and foremost, rot and decay would set in with alarming speed. The constant moisture wicking up from the ground would rapidly break down the wood fibers, turning sturdy, weight-bearing logs into crumbling pulp. This organic decomposition wasn't just about structural weakness. It also created a prime breeding ground for fungus and mold, which thrive in damp conditions. These aren't just unpleasant. Some molds can cause respiratory issues and chronic illness, a serious threat when medical help is days or weeks away. Furthermore, this decay would then attract legions of wood-boring insects, termites, carpenter ants, and various beetles, which would further compromise the structure, turning a cozy cabin into a rapidly disintegrating ruin, often without visible warning until it was too late. Beyond biological decay, an uneven, unstable, or simply weak foundation meant the entire structure was inherently unstable and prone to catastrophic failure. If the base wasn't level, or if the supporting elements shifted, the heavy logs of the walls could begin to rack, creating dangerous pressures and weak points. The entire cabin could settle unevenly, walls could warp, and the roof could eventually sag or even collapse, especially under the immense, crushing weight of heavy winter snows or during periods of relentless, high winds common in exposed wilderness environments. Imagine being trapped inside a collapsing cabin during a blizzard, with freezing temperatures and no means of escape or rescue, a truly terrifying and often fatal prospect. Furthermore, a poor or non-existent foundation offered easy, unobstructed access for all manner of unwanted pests and predators. Rodents like mice and rats, constantly seeking warmth and food, would find their way in with effortless ease through gaps at ground level. More dangerously, venomous snakes, scorpions, and other dangerous arthropods could also find refuge and entry, turning a supposed sanctuary into a hazardous and anxiety-inducing living environment. Even larger animals, driven by hunger or curiosity, might be tempted to investigate if the base wasn't secure. Instead, the skilled mountain man meticulously selected durable, naturally rot-resistant stones or large, flat rocks to create a raised, level base for their cabin. These carefully chosen and positioned foundation stones served multiple crucial purposes. They physically elevated the wooden structure, preventing direct contact with damp soil and allowing for vital air circulation underneath the cabin, which dramatically inhibited rot and fungal growth. They also provided a stable, immovable, and perfectly level platform upon which the heavy log walls could rest securely, distributing the enormous weight evenly. This seemingly simple yet painstakingly executed step, involving careful leveling and positioning, drastically extended the life of their cabin, and by extension, their own lives. It was not just good construction, it was an investment in structural integrity, health, and long-term survival in the unforgiving wild. Deadly mistake, number 3. Choosing the wrong wood or ignoring curing, the greenhorn's gamble. The third critical error that highly skilled mountain men meticulously steered clear of was using uncured, green wood, or equally detrimental, selecting unsuitable timber species for their cabins. You might think that any tree cut down in the forest would suffice, but this was a profound and often fatal misunderstanding. This mistake didn't lead to an immediate collapse, but rather a slow, inevitable structural degradation that made the cabin uninhabitable or structurally unsound over time. Freshly cut or green, wood is absolutely laden with moisture. A tree's living cells are full of water, which can account for a significant portion of its weight. When this wood dries out, it undergoes a dramatic and unpredictable transformation. As the water evaporates, the wood fibers shrink, twist, and warp in unpredictable ways. This process, known as seasoning or curing, would lead to massive, unsightly, and structurally compromising gaps appearing between the logs in the cabin walls. Imagine spending weeks felling trees, shaping them, and meticulously stacking them, only for your walls to develop gaping cracks that let in wind, rain, snow, and every small creature seeking warmth. Such a cabin would be impossible to heat efficiently, perpetually drafty, and prone to rapid decay from constant moisture intrusion. Building with green wood was a guarantee of a rapidly deteriorating, inefficient, and utterly miserable structure, requiring constant, often impossible maintenance just to stay standing. Beyond the moisture content, the species of wood itself was paramount. Not all trees are created equal for building purposes. Some species are highly susceptible to rot, like aspen or cottonwood, which break down quickly when exposed to moisture and insects. Others are inherently weaker or more brittle, making them unsuitable for bearing heavy loads, especially the immense weight of a log roof and accumulated snow. A wise mountain man was a master of dendrology, the study of trees. They were intimately familiar with the properties of local timber, understanding which species offered the best combination of strength, durability, insulation, and resistance to pests and rot. They would prefer tough, long-lasting, and naturally rot-resistant species like various types of cedar, spruce, fir, or certain dense pines. These woods not only held up better to moisture and insect infestation, but also offered superior insulation properties, critical for surviving frigid winters. They understood the absolute necessity of seasoning or curing their timber before construction. This meant more than just simply felling a tree. It often involved a significant investment of time and labor before the actual building even began. They would fell trees months, or even a full year, in advance of their planned construction. The bark would be meticulously stripped off the logs to deter wood-boring insects and allow for more efficient drying. The logs would then be carefully stacked in specific ways, typically off the ground on skids, with spacers between each layer, to allow maximum air circulation, while simultaneously protecting them from direct rain and prolonged dampness. This patient, often tedious process allowed the logs to slowly and evenly dry, shrink, and stabilize. Rushing this crucial step was not merely an inconvenience, it was a gamble with deadly consequences, ensuring a structurally unsound, uncomfortable, and potentially life-threatening shelter in a world where a reliable roof over one's head was the difference between life and death. Deadly mistake. Sure 2. Overlooking proper chinking and sealing. The frigid failure. Imagine painstakingly building a cabin, only to have the biting wind and relentless snow whip right through the gaps in the walls. This brings us to the second deadly mistake: neglecting proper chinking and sealing between the logs. This wasn't merely about comfort. It was about conserving body heat and preventing hypothermia in extreme conditions. A drafty cabin is, quite simply, a cold cabin. In the brutal wilderness winters, where temperatures could plummet far below freezing, heat loss through unsealed gaps was a death sentence. All the precious heat generated by a roaring fire would simply escape, making it impossible to stay warm, leading to exhaustion, frostbite, and eventually, hypothermia. Every watt of heat generated from hard-won firewood was precious. Beyond the cold, unsealed gaps were an open invitation for an array of unwelcome guests. They provided easy pest entry for biting insects like mosquitoes and flies in warmer months, and more critically, for rodents like mice and rats seeking warmth and food during winter. Larger, more dangerous creatures, like snakes or even small predators, could also exploit such openings. Furthermore, water intrusion was a constant threat. Rain, melting snow, or even heavy condensation could seep through unsealed cracks, leading to internal dampness. This dampness fostered mold and mildew, which are detrimental to health, and accelerated the rot of the logs themselves, further compromising the cabin's structural integrity. Mountain men were meticulous in their chinking process. This involved filling every single space between their logs using a variety of readily available natural materials, a mixture of mud and clay, fibrous moss, small flat stones, and wood slivers. These materials were carefully packed, sometimes even reinforced with animal hair or plant fibers, to create a tight, insulating seal. This process was incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive, often requiring multiple layers and maintenance, but it was absolutely vital. They understood that a cabin wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It needed to be a sealed, insulated refuge, a true sanctuary against the relentless assault of the elements. Their lives depended on it being an airtight envelope. Deadly mistake. Number 1. Building without a defensive mindset. The predator's welcome. And finally, the most deadly mistake a mountain man never made, one that was always at the forefront of their minds, was building without an inherent defensive strategy. In the untamed wilderness, danger didn't just come from blizzards or floods. It also came from predators, both the four-legged and the two-legged kind. A cabin was not just a home, it was a fortress, and its design reflected that grim reality. They rigorously avoided building in deep hollows, dense thickets, or locations that obscured their vision. Instead, they often chose strategic locations that offered a commanding vantage point, a slight rise, an open clearing, or a position that allowed them to observe the surrounding terrain for a considerable distance. This enabled them to spot approaching threats, whether it was a grizzly bear, a rival trapper, or a potentially hostile native raiding party, giving them precious time to prepare a defense. Their cabins typically featured a single, sturdy, and well-secured entry point. Multiple doors or large, easily accessible windows were liabilities, offering too many points of entry for attackers. The main door was often reinforced with thicker logs or internal bracing, sometimes even designed to slide or pivot in a way that made it difficult to breach from the outside. Windows, if present at all, were usually small, narrow, and placed high up, designed more for light and ventilation than for views, and often covered with shutters or heavy hides that could be secured from the inside. Every aspect of the cabin's placement was considered for its strategic advantage. Was there a steep cliff face that offered an easy approach from above? Was the cabin exposed on all sides? Or could natural barriers like rock formations or dense stands of trees be incorporated into its defense? They used the terrain to their advantage, making their cabins as defensible as possible. While not directly part of the structural build, the internal layout often allowed for quick access to their firearms and other defensive tools, with rifles placed within immediate reach from their sleeping area, or strategically placed loopholes, allowing them to fire outwards if necessary. Their cabins were not just homes. They were defensive outposts, designed for vigilance and rapid response. Every decision, from the choice of site to the placement of the door and windows, was profoundly influenced by the unyielding need for security and self-preservation in a world where danger lurked around every corner. So there you have it. The top 5 deadly mistakes the incredibly resourceful American mountain men meticulously avoided when constructing their vital cabins. These weren't merely about architectural principles or carpentry skills. They were about a profound, almost spiritual understanding of their environment, an unwavering commitment to quality born from necessity, and an ever-present awareness of their own fragile survival in the face of immense challenges. From patiently scouting the perfect defensible location and laying a rock-solid, elevated foundation, to carefully curing their timber, meticulously sealing every crack against the elements, and always maintaining a vigilant, defensive posture. These men built not just shelters, but monuments to self-reliance, ingenuity, and sheer grit. Their cabins stood as enduring testaments to their wisdom, their endurance, and their unyielding spirit in a world that constantly tested the limits of human resilience. Their legacy reminds us that true strength often lies not in what we can acquire, but in what we can build, understand, and defend with our own hands and minds. What do you think of these wilderness survival insights? Are there any other crucial mistakes you believe these legendary figures navigated, or perhaps lessons from their lives that still resonate today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives. Imagine a world untouched. Towering, snow-capped peaks pierced a boundless sky, and ancient forests held the breath of centuries. This was the raw, untamed canvas of the American West in the early to mid-19th century, home to the legendary American mountain men. These rugged individualists built their homes by hand in spots we'd consider paradise today. Hidden valleys by crystal-clear rivers, or clearings offering breathtaking panoramic views. These weren't just temporary shelters. Many were substantial cabins, crafted with sweat and hope. Yet, as the 19th century unfolded, a strange pattern emerged. These idyllic, perfectly situated cabins were often left to decay, reclaimed by the very wilderness they once tamed. Why would men who poured their essence into these havens simply walk away? The answer is a complex tapestry woven from economic upheaval, relentless demographic shifts, and the deeply ingrained, restless spirit of the mountain man himself. Join us as we journey back in time to uncover the compelling reasons behind these forgotten frontier dreams. Chapter 1. The Allure of the Beaver and the Strategic Life of the Trapper. To truly grasp why these seemingly perfect cabins were later abandoned, we must first immerse ourselves in the captivating and perilous world that lured these men westward. The North American fur trade. More specifically, the insatiable global demand for beaver pelts. In the early 1800s, a beaver hat wasn't merely a fashion accessory. It was the ultimate symbol of status, wealth, and sophistication in the grand drawing rooms of London, Paris, and the burgeoning cities of the eastern United States. This intense, almost feverish demand created an economic engine so powerful it pulled adventurous spirits, daring entrepreneurs, and restless souls deeper and deeper into the vast, uncharted wilderness of the American West. The American mountain men weren't just adventurers stumbling through the wild. They were highly specialized, incredibly skilled, and deeply motivated entrepreneurs. Their entire existence revolved around the annual cycle of trapping. From the moment the ice thawed in spring until the bitter onset of winter, their days were consumed by the pursuit of beaver. A good cabin site, therefore, was far more than just a place to lay one's head at night. It was a strategic operational base, a meticulously chosen stronghold in a hostile environment. Imagine a sturdy log cabin, often built with impressive ingenuity from local timber, positioned perfectly near a winding stream known to be teeming with beaver. This location wasn't accidental. It offered immediate and vital access to their primary quarry, minimizing travel time and maximizing efficiency. Beyond just beaver access, these cabins provided crucial shelter from the brutal, often deadly, Rocky Mountain winters. Blizzards could rage for days, burying everything in feet of snow, and temperatures could plummet to unimaginable lows. Without a well-built shelter, survival was a gamble. Within the rough-hewn walls of these cabins, they stored their precious supplies: dozens of iron traps, valuable salt for curing hides, gunpowder and lead for casting bullets, and perhaps even a rare luxury like coffee beans or tobacco. It was also a secure place to process their valuable furs, carefully skinning, stretching, drying, and bundling them for the highly anticipated annual rendezvous. Those chaotic, exhilarating, and often lawless gatherings where trappers met with supply trains from the east to trade their year's catch for new provisions and a taste of civilization. While some cabins were indeed temporary, hastily erected for a single season, historical accounts and archaeological discoveries increasingly reveal that many were quite substantial. Evidence suggests sturdy foundations, well-built hearths indicating prolonged use, and even remnants of small plots for growing basic vegetables. These were places where a man might spend multiple consecutive winters, truly carving out a life and a sense of permanence in the wild. The ideal spot consistently featured proximity to reliable fresh water sources, abundant game trails for sustenance, defensible positions against potential threats, and, critically, that profound sense of isolation and untamed wilderness that many of these men craved above all else. They were, in essence, the undisputed masters of their immediate domain, living a life of unparalleled self-reliance and raw independence, all powered by the relentless, lucrative pursuit of the elusive beaver. This intricate connection between the beaver, the cabin, and the economic landscape of the early 19th century is the foundation upon which their story, and ultimately their departure, is built. Chapter 2. The economic tides turn, the collapse of the fur trade. But even the most robust and seemingly inexhaustible economic engines can falter, and often, the very success that propels them leads to their eventual demise. The burgeoning beaver trade, which had fueled the mountain man's existence and carved out his place in the wilderness, was no exception. The relentless, large-scale trapping, year after year, by hundreds of trappers pushing deeper into virgin territories, began to take its inevitable and devastating toll. Beaver populations, once so incredibly abundant they seemed limitless, started to dwindle dramatically in the more easily accessible trapping grounds of the Rocky Mountains and beyond. The immediate consequence of this depletion was a significant drop in catch rates. What once might have been a profitable season with relatively little effort now required days, even weeks, of strenuous and often fruitless work to secure a meager number of pelts. This forced trappers to push ever deeper into truly remote, unexplored, and often more dangerous territories. A cabin that was once perfectly situated in a rich, thriving beaver watershed might now be miles, or even days, from any remaining viable beaver streams. The effort-to-reward ratio skewed dramatically, making the arduous life of a trapper less financially rewarding and increasingly unsustainable. The economic incentive that had drawn these men into the wilderness, that had justified their incredible hardships and risks, was slowly but surely eroding. The golden age of the American fur trade reached its zenith in the mid-1830s. The great annual rendezvous, those legendary boisterous gatherings where thousands of trappers, traders, and Native Americans converged to exchange furs for supplies, began to shrink in size and vibrancy. The mood among the mountain men shifted from optimistic endeavor to growing concern. Then came the final, fatal blow, delivered not by depleted resources in the wilderness, but by a fickle change in distant European fashion. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, the sleek, lightweight, and sophisticated silk hat began to eclipse the heavy, somewhat cumbersome beaver felt hat in popularity across the fashionable drawing rooms of London, Paris, and the eastern United States. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was a relatively swift and devastating market shift. Suddenly, the primary demand for their hard-won pelts evaporated almost overnight. The market for beaver fur plummeted, and with it, the price. For the mountain men, this economic collapse was catastrophic. Their entire livelihood, their reason for being in the wilderness, was tied directly to the value of beaver fur. Without a viable market, their immense efforts were rendered worthless. Those great cabin spots, once bustling with activity and promising a steady income from nearby trapping grounds, became economically obsolete. The very purpose of their existence in that particular location had dissolved. For a man whose entire existence revolved around the profitability of trapping, staying put in an exhausted, now valueless trapping ground was not just impractical, it was a path to destitution. The land itself hadn't changed, the beauty remained, but its economic value, at least for them, had plummeted to near zero. This forced a stark and immediate choice for every mountain man: adapt to a radically changed world, or move on in search of a new purpose, a new frontier, or simply a new way to survive. This profound economic shift was arguably the single most impactful factor in the widespread abandonment of their cherished wilderness homes. Chapter 3. The relentless march of civilization, settlers, and society. While the economic backbone of the fur trade withered away, another, equally powerful and ultimately unstoppable force was reshaping the very landscape and destiny of the American West. The relentless, often overwhelming westward expansion of American settlement. Close on the heels of the mountain men, often guided by the very trails they had blazed and the knowledge they had painstakingly acquired, came waves of homesteaders, farmers, ranchers, and prospectors. These newcomers arrived with a distinctly different vision for the land, not as a wild resource to be harvested and left untamed, but as territory to be claimed, cultivated, and irrevocably transformed into a reflection of the society they had left behind. What was once pristine, untamed wilderness, the solitary domain of the mountain man, was now being meticulously surveyed, divided, fenced, and ultimately plowed under. Ancient forests were cleared for timber and to make way for agricultural fields. Rivers, once free-flowing arteries of the wild, were increasingly dammed or diverted for irrigation. Slowly but surely, towns and permanent settlements began to spring up, often in places where mountain men had once silently set their traps or built their secluded cabins. For many mountain men, whose very identity was inextricably intertwined with their profound independence and the deep solitude of the wild, this relentless encroachment was nothing short of an invasion. It was an assault on their way of life, a slow strangulation of the freedom they cherished above all else. The establishment of formal land ownership further complicated matters, creating direct conflicts. Most mountain men built their temporary or semi-permanent cabins on what they considered open, communal wilderness, land that belonged to no one, or rather, to everyone. They didn't operate with legal deeds, titles, or government-sanctioned claims. As territories became organized, with federal land offices opening and legal frameworks for property ownership being put in place, these informal cabin sites became incredibly vulnerable. A settler, arriving with a freshly stamped government land patent, could legally claim the very plot where a mountain man had toiled to build his home, forcing him off with the backing of nascent law enforcement. The frontier, which had once seemed boundless, was closing, and with it, the era of unlimited open range and unrestricted movement. The very presence of permanent settlements, of new neighbors, established roads, schools, and eventually burgeoning communities with their own rules and social expectations, eroded the wildness that the mountain men sought and thrived within. Their cabins, once symbols of self-reliance and mastery over the wilderness, became inconvenient obstacles in the path of a rapidly industrializing, agricultural society. For men who valued boundless freedom and self-determination above all else, adapting to a settled, law-abiding, domesticated existence was often an unbearable thought. They simply couldn't breathe in a world that was suddenly confined by fences, property lines, and the constant presence of others. The frontier was less about hunting and trapping, and more about planting crops and raising families. This fundamental clash of values and lifestyles made continued residence in many of these once ideal cabin spots utterly untenable for the true mountain man. Chapter 4. The restless spirit, personal motivations, and the lure of the unknown. Beyond the powerful economic forces and the relentless march of civilization, there lies perhaps the most profound and deeply personal reason for the abandonment of these seemingly perfect cabin sites: the very inherent nature and restless spirit of the mountain men themselves. These were not men who dreamed of a quiet life in a picket-fenced farm or a cozy, predictable home in a bustling town. They were drawn to the frontier by a visceral, almost primal desire for something more: the raw thrill of the hunt, the profound challenge of survival against formidable odds, the intoxicating allure of endless, uncharted horizons. They were, in many cases, solitary by choice, finding a deep solace and strength in the vast, silent wilderness that few others could comprehend. Consider their personalities. Many had come from troubled pasts, or simply from lives that felt too confined, too predictable. They sought an existence where their only master was the wilderness itself, where laws were often self-imposed, and where courage and cunning were the true currency. While some mountain men did eventually integrate into the new frontier towns, becoming invaluable guides for emigrant trains, scouts for the burgeoning U.S. Army, or shrewd traders in nascent settlements, a significant number simply weren't wired for a settled existence. The very notion of domesticity, of being confined to one spot, contradicted the very essence of who they were. Their hearts belonged to the open range, to the untamed river where fish ran free, to the towering peaks where human laws held little sway. A meticulously built cabin, no matter how comfortable or strategically located, could quickly begin to feel like a gilded cage to a man whose spirit craved boundless exploration. Their highly developed resilience, their incredible adaptability, and their fierce independence, the very qualities that made them absolute masters of the wilderness and successful in their trade, also made them profoundly restless when faced with the constraints and demands of encroaching civilization. The mundane daily routines of farming, the rigid social demands of a burgeoning community, the absence of immediate danger or grand adventure, simply didn't resonate with their adventurous, often untamed souls. They thrived on unpredictability, on the constant challenge of pitting their wits against nature. Many were essentially itinerants by nature. They followed the game, migrating with the seasons, chasing the promise of new discoveries, or simply answering the magnetic pull of the unknown. A cabin, while a welcome respite from the biting cold of winter or the driving rains of spring, was rarely viewed as a permanent anchor. It was a temporary base camp, a place to rest and resupply before the next journey. The idea of rooting themselves permanently, of abandoning the endless possibilities that lay just beyond the next ridge, was often an anathema. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, always looking for the next horizon, the next challenge, the next virgin stretch of untamed land. This deep-seated wanderlust, this unquenchable thirst for the wild, played a crucial, often overlooked role in their willingness to walk away from even the most great and comfortable cabin spots. Their homes were wherever the trail led them, not a fixed point on a map. Chapter 5. The Unforgiving Hand of Nature and Intertribal Conflicts. Even the most perfectly chosen cabin spot remained at the mercy of the wilderness's raw power. Nature, beautiful as it was, could also be relentlessly unforgiving. A great location today could become an uninhabitable disaster zone tomorrow. Floods could inundate river valleys, sweeping away structures and vital supplies. Forest fires, ignited by lightning or even accidental human carelessness, could sweep through timbered areas, obliterating everything in their path and destroying hunting grounds for years to come. Landslides could suddenly alter entire landscapes, rendering a once sheltered cabin dangerously exposed. A particularly brutal winter, with record snowfall or sustained bitter cold, could render a location completely inaccessible, isolating a trapper for months and making hunting and trapping virtually impossible. While not the primary, overarching reason for the widespread abandonment, sudden and severe natural events undoubtedly forced many a mountain man to pack up and seek more favorable, less hazardous terrain. The wilderness offered opportunity, but it also demanded constant vigilance and respect for its formidable power. Furthermore, the interactions with various Native American tribes became an increasingly complex and dangerous factor. As westward expansion intensified, tensions escalated. While many mountain men forged strong, mutually beneficial relationships with Native American communities, often learning their languages and survival techniques, conflicts were also a stark reality. A seemingly safe cabin site could quickly become a target or be situated in a contested territory, forcing its inhabitants to abandon it for safer ground. The constant threat of raiding parties or tribal warfare, especially as resources dwindled and territories were encroached upon, added another layer of risk to an already perilous existence, sometimes making even the most comfortable cabin untenable. The frontier was a land of opportunity, but also of constant vigilance and potential conflict. So, the story of why American mountain men abandoned their great cabin spots is not a simple tale of choice, but a complex narrative woven from powerful converging forces. It was the devastating collapse of the beaver fur trade that ripped away their economic livelihood. It was the relentless, unstoppable westward expansion of settlers that consumed their beloved wilderness and imposed a structured society they couldn't abide. It was their own indomitable, restless spirits, inherently unsuited for domesticity, that propelled them deeper into the shrinking wild. And it was the unpredictable, unforgiving hand of nature and the ever-present threat of intertribal conflicts that added layers of peril to their already arduous lives. Today, the faint, decaying remnants of these cabins, a few weathered logs, a collapsed chimney, a faint outline in the earth, stand as silent, poignant monuments to a vanished era. They are more than just forgotten structures. They are echoes of incredible hardship, unparalleled freedom, and a profound, intimate connection to a land that was still largely wild. They serve as a powerful reminder that even the most great and desirable locations are subject to the relentless, transformative currents of time and human ambition. The American mountain men, in their abandonment of these once cherished spots, weren't simply leaving behind wood and stone. They were leaving behind an entire way of life, a rugged individualism that helped forge a nation, forever etching their adventurous spirit into the very fabric of American history and inspiring generations to seek their own frontier, whatever it may be. A mountain man lived solo off the land, relying solely on himself, without respite. Every task carried weight. Eat or starve, mend or freeze, sharpen or dull. But what did it truly take to survive a full day in the wild? How did he cook, trap, tan, patch, clean, and endure day after day? The dark forest loomed heavily around him. The wind whispered through the pines, slowly pulling frost from the branches like breath escaping from a slumbering beast. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Inside, the cabin felt more like a cave than a home. The fire had long since dwindled to mere embers, a faint glow concealed beneath a layer of ash. The air wasn't sharp enough to bite, but it hung heavily, settling into the cracks and seeping through the moss-stuffed chinks. This kind of cold crouched in the corners. It didn't scream, it lingered. Beneath a tangle of buffalo hides, worn wool, and a faded Hudson's Bay blanket, the mountain man lay motionless. Not yet. He remained still, alert, breaths forming pale puffs in the chilly air. In the wilderness, you don't spring up without good reason. Instead, you attune yourself to the sounds, an owl's call, the rustle of a fox. Silence meant nothing moved except for the expansive dark. At last, he began to stir. Slowly, he swung one leg over the side of the cot, then the other. His feet met the hard-packed earth with a muted thud. The ground was perpetually cold. Clad in long johns and a flannel shirt soaked with years of sweat and smoke, he was acutely aware of his environment. His rifle lay within arm's reach from the cot, while his hatchet rested securely in the stump by the hearth. Everything in the cabin had its designated spot, each location justified by purpose. He grasped the lantern, an old tin fixture that barely flickered to life. The light illuminated only his boots. The deer-hide flap serving as a door fluttered in the breeze, allowing the sharp breath of pine and cold to invade the space. Crouching by the hearth, shoulders hunched, he exhaled lightly across the coals. There was no rush. Fire does not favor haste. He gathered pine shavings, bark curls, and twigs. Gradually, the coals caught, a spark igniting into flame, then light. Heat emanated gradually. Smoke climbed through the chimney gap. If the draft remained steady, it would escape. Otherwise, it threatened to descend and blacken the rafters, a common occurrence he had come to accept. You don't confront the cabin. You learn to coexist with it. The cabin was small, hardly larger than a freight wagon. It contained a single room, no windows, a low cot, and shelves nailed directly into log walls filled with essentials. Cornmeal, flour, dried apples, salt pork, jerked meat swathed in old rags, a couple of tin pots, a powder horn, a mold for casting round balls, and a squat iron kettle. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, sweat, and time. He warmed his hands by the fire, watching his breath rise in white clouds. His gaze shifted from the ceiling to the walls, and then to an empty space, his mind elsewhere. He was mentally retracing the trap lines from the previous day, the ones by the creek bend and the deadfall beyond the ridge. He could visualize them perfectly. Stakes, snares, bait lines. Had the bait frozen? Had the beavers migrated downstream? It was possible. The last freeze had thickened the ice, making it stable enough to walk on, or treacherous enough to fall through. It was hard to say. He reached for the water bladder and poured its contents into the kettle. If it hadn't frozen solid, it would warm up quickly. If it had, he'd need to chip it out in chunks. He surveyed his surroundings once more. Coffee was long gone, weeks in fact. Instead, he pulled out some sassafras bark from a pouch. The root brew wasn't luxurious, but it was hot and offered a comforting burn as it slid down his throat. With a crack of his shoulders, he made a thorough check of the cabin. The flint fit snugly in the lock. The powder horn was sealed tight, and his knife gleamed sharp. His gloves were dry. He laced up his boots and buckled his belt, continuing his thorough inspection. Horn spoon, patch knife, bag of lead, patching cloth. Everything was precisely where it should be. By the door, a strip of pemmican dangled like weathered leather. He cut off a piece and savored it slowly, using the same knife for all his tasks. An enveloping silence filled the room as he stared into the distance, contemplating the terrain. How far he would journey, what hazards to steer clear of, and where he might find signs of wildlife. Stepping outside, he didn't venture far, just enough to breathe in the invigorating air. The crusted snow crunched beneath his boots, and the trees loomed tall and still, their dark silhouettes standing vigil against the winter landscape. He stepped back into the biting chill, the air sharp enough to sting his skin. Moving cautiously, he took the familiar frozen path to the stream, where cold mist hovered above the water's surface. His traps lay half-submerged, their iron jaws clamped open and waiting for a catch. One by one, he inspected them, heavy double-spring footholds anchored to saplings he had hammered into the riverbank days earlier. For bait, he used castoreum, the oily musk extracted from beaver glands and stored in carved wooden cups. The scent was unpleasant, but it sure was effective. If you're interested in learning more about the traps used by mountain men, we've got an entire episode dedicated to each type. We also dive deep into hunting methods, covering how they tracked, stalked, and captured game in the wild. Check those out if you haven't already. Now, back to our story. After thoroughly checking his traps, the mountain man crouched down, his hands wet as he reset a sprung trap. He stepped into the water, disguising his scent and washing himself from the land. Beavers were clever. A whiff of the wrong thing, and they would vanish. Before leaving, he splashed water over his footprints. A small tactic, but it helped him remain unseen. Back at the cabin, smoke wafted from the chimney like a fading breath as the world began to awaken. A loon called from somewhere beyond the trees, and leaves rustled with hidden movement. Another day had begun. He surveyed a trail winding between roots and stones, slick with dew alongside the stream. Nothing had changed, but it was no time to lose concentration. The reassuring weight of his knife, tomahawk, and musket kept him grounded. At the water's edge, he crouched, listening. The water whispered by, a fish leapt, and a frog splashed. Yet he looked for other signs. Shaved stumps, chewed saplings, and slick slide marks in the mud. The beavers had certainly been active. Good news. He leaned in, setting the trap again. No movement, no catch. He frowned briefly, then reset the brush to enhance cover. With that done, he moved on. The next trap was near a thicket of willows, close to a lodge. The mud held fresh, webbed tracks. He knelt down and found the chain tight. Something was struggling below. He pulled it up slowly, water streaming off dark fur. The beaver thrashed feebly, nearly spent. Then, with a single swift strike, the fight ended. The mountain man offered a whispered thanks, sincere and not just for show. He inspected the pelt, thick and prime, sure to fetch a good price back east. After resetting the trap, camouflaging it with mud and twigs, he added more castoreum as a lure. With the beaver secured to his pack, he continued down the line. Some traps yielded catches, while others remained empty. He worked with purpose as the sun climbed higher, warming the chill from his coat. Birds chirped in the trees, and squirrels dashed through the branches. Life was all around him, bustling beneath the quiet surface. He didn't need to speak. The land communicated in its own ways. You just needed to listen. With traps behind him and a beaver draped heavily over his shoulder, he turned back toward the cabin. The weight pressed against him, but he welcomed it. What mattered was that one more task was completed, one more part of the daily grind. Outside the cabin, he hoisted the beaver onto a low branch, where the cool air would preserve it until he was ready to skin it. There was no hurry. Skinning required calm hands and a sharp knife. Sloppiness would only lead to a ruined pelt, and waste was simply not an option. He picked up the bucket at the cabin's entrance and made his way to the stream once more. As he reached the bank, he plunged the bucket into the water, filling it smoothly with a single motion. The cold bit at his fingers, but he paid it no mind. Upon entering the cabin, which was quiet and dim, he noticed the soft light filtering through the gaps in the logs. Setting the bucket down by the hearth, where the last embers glimmered, he retrieved his prized whetstone, a piece of novaculite, hard and clean. A trapper of his caliber knew the importance of maintaining a sharp blade. He settled down, placing the knife with its smooth bone handle across his lap. After wetting the stone thoroughly, he drew the blade back and forth in steady strokes. A soft hiss filled the air. Satisfied with his work, he tested the edge against his forearm, and a patch of hair came away cleanly. Good enough. He stood up and grabbed a broom made from bundled twigs, sweeping away dust, ashes, and scraps. His tools were returned to their rightful places. Hides were stacked, and his rifle was inspected. Everything had its own spot. With the cabin in order, he added a few logs to the hearth. The flames caught, and warmth slowly spread through the room. Having done what needed to be done, he relaxed in front of the fire. There was no need for words. The gentle crackling mingled with the sounds of nature outside. There was plenty left to accomplish, but for the moment, he let the warmth envelop him. The day was still young. By noon, he had successfully checked his morning traps, netting a beaver, a fox, and 2 muskrats. Clean kills. Carrying them back was second nature, the familiar weight resting comfortably on his shoulders. Outside the cabin, he readied himself for the task of skinning. Knife in hand, he began with the beaver, one swift cut from tail to lip, maintaining a neat, straight line. He carefully peeled the hide away, taking his time with the blade. The underfur gleamed, a sign of its value. A careless miscut could be costly. He rolled the carcass, maneuvering the edge expertly, finishing the job cleanly. Next came the muskrats, followed by the fox. The smaller game required a different technique. He strung each one up by the hind legs, cut around the ankles, and pulled the skin down as if peeling off a sock. It demanded strength. The delicate skins required precision, as even a small tear could render them worthless. He laid each pelt across wooden frames, securing them tightly with rawhide. Propping the frames against the cabin wall, he angled them just so to catch both sun and breeze. Smoothing out any creases, he checked for tears, ensuring nothing sagged. Those pelts were vital to his livelihood, the reason he toiled in this harsh land. Nothing went to waste. Later, he'd butcher the remaining meat. The beaver tail, especially rich and fatty, would be set aside for a special meal. But first, the hides required his full attention. He cut a slender willow branch, bending it into a hoop and tying it with sinew. This frame would evenly stretch the beaver hide. Working methodically, he laid the pelt fur down over the hoop. With a bone awl, he punched holes around the edge. Steady hand, even spacing, no room for error. Afterward, he threaded rawhide strips through each hole, pulling them tight to keep the hide flat against the frame. No slack, no wrinkles. An uneven stretch would lead to rot. Once secured, he leaned the hoop against the cabin wall, angled to catch sun and breeze. He repeated this process for the muskrat and fox pelts, 1 pelt for each frame. Running his hands over them, he sought out folds or pulls, adjusting the tension as needed. The drying process would take several days, demanding constant attention. One careless day, and a pelt could go to waste. With the hides taken care of, he shifted his focus to the meat. The beaver tail, a fatty delicacy, deserved special attention. He cleaned it meticulously, removing the scaly skin and scrubbing away the musk before soaking it overnight in a brine of salt and vinegar. Once properly infused, it would cook up beautifully. Tomorrow, he planned to simmer it slowly with baking soda to tenderize the flesh, then pan-fry it in butter, mustard, and a splash of wine, a rare treat on the frontier. Next, he turned to the lean cuts from the beaver, muskrat, and fox, which required preservation. He sorted through the meat, trimming it and setting aside the portions he'd eat right away. The rest needed to be smoked. His smokehouse, a sturdy log hut sealed with mud to retain heat, was ready for the task. Inside, he hung strips of meat from wooden beams, spacing them apart for optimal airflow. After lighting the pit, he added hickory and applewood to the flames. A gentle stream of smoke began to rise, enveloping the meat in a rich, savory aroma. This fire would smolder for days, preserving and enhancing the flavor of every piece. The day was still young, and much work awaited him. The afternoon would bring its own set of tasks, maintaining the relentless rhythm of survival in the wild. The sun hung low in the sky, slicing through the pine and aspen with a harsh golden glow. Somewhere amid the trees, a bird called once and then fell silent. The mountain man soon spotted some game nearby and decided to embark on a quick hunt, intending to return before sunset. He took a moment to absorb the vastness of the forest, the rich layers of green, the patchy browns, the unending wilderness. With the sun indicating he had plenty of time, he set his sights on a familiar game trail, worn into the ground by the routine of hooves. The path narrowed quickly. Laurel and choke cherry bushes leaned in, their branches reaching out like claws. He ducked low, moving quietly on the balls of his feet, avoiding any heavy footsteps. His breath was calm, drawn deeply through his nose as he took in the scents of pine, damp moss, decay, and a faint animal musk in the air. Recent, unmistakable. He froze, dropping into a crouch, not thinking but instinctively knowing. His eyes scanned the forest floor. There it was, beneath a fern, a small, sharp print, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. He lowered himself further, his hand hovering just above the imprint. Cloven and wide set. Definitely a whitetail, likely a doe. Perhaps not alone. He didn't need to estimate how fresh the tracks were. He could sense it. The edges were soft, still moist. No signs of crumble. The pine needles hadn't shifted yet. She had run, not walked. He moved again, half rising, eyes glancing to the left. The tree line seemed to hold its breath. The tracks angled towards the south-southeast, descending into a gentle draw. A wise choice. Plenty of cover and an easy slope with the wind at her back. But the wind was unpredictable, swirling among the trees. An advantage for him. She wouldn't catch his scent unless it shifted, so he pressed on, this time more cautiously. Cradling his rifle instead of having it slung over his shoulder, he used his left hand to clear away the bramble. Every 10 steps. Stop. Listen. There's always some squirrel chattering or a jay screeching. But when the woods fall silent, that's when it counts. Then he spotted a sign, birch bark scraped away, not just grazed but chewed, a series of thin, vertical grooves made by deer teeth. The sap was still fresh. She had been feeding. She still wasn't spooked. She was close. The mountain man crouched low, pressing his palm into a disturbed patch of the trail as he brought his fingers to his nose. A strong, bitter scent lingered. She must have bedded here, maybe just an hour ago. likely heading toward water. Suddenly, he chose to veer off the main path. No direct pursuit. He recalled the wise words of a trapper. Don't follow the deer. Flank where it went. With that in mind, he arced wide, moving higher in elevation. The incline gave him a view down the draw. The wind kissed his face. Perfect conditions. Then he halted, sensing movement. It was barely noticeable, a flicker behind the young aspen trees. With a steady hand, he raised his rifle, smoothly and silently, driven by instinct, not the doe. A yearling stood before him, all jittery limbs and twitching ears, its velvet muzzle working at the moss-crusted log. Though its muscles were taut, ready to spring, it browsed calmly, unaware. The hunter's breath stilled in his chest. His finger hovered above the trigger. Hold. The mother would be close, might double back through this draw. He became stone, his eyes mapping every shifting shadow, every quiver in the understory. Then movement, not ahead, but to the east. Ravaged foliage, broken stems, deep splayed prints that spoke of weight. Different quarry altogether. He sank to one knee, examining the browse line, teeth marks scoring bark 6 feet up. No whitetail could reach that high. Elk, and fresh, decision made without conscious thought. He pivoted soundlessly, following this new promise of meat. The mountainside turned treacherous. Brambles clutched at his leggings like beggars' hands. Ferns lashed his thighs with wet scorn. The very earth conspired against him, loose scree shifting underfoot, gnarled roots rising to trip him. He moved with deliberate silence, placing each step as carefully as a chess move, deaf to the forest's chatter, the gossip of jays, the sighing pines, the endless rustling commentary of leaves. Only the clues mattered now. That freshly broken twig oozing sap, the tuft of tawny hair caught on rough bark, the musky tang cutting through the pine-scented air. The message was clear. Close now. Very close. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in fragmented gold. He climbed steadily until breakthrough. The trees surrendered to a narrow ridgeline trail. As his moccasin touched the packed earth, his body became pure tension, coiled, hyper-aware. Then the wind shifted, and with it came the scent. Warm, animal, immediate. The bull elk stood like a monarch behind the brush screen, its polished antlers catching the last golden light as it grazed undisturbed. With practiced patience, the mountain man raised his hawken rifle, settling the sights with deliberate care. Breath stilled, finger poised, then betrayal. A shifting wind carried his scent. The elk's head jerked up, nostrils flaring as its ears swiveled toward danger. For one frozen heartbeat, their eyes met through the foliage. Crack! The forest erupted as the bull vanished in a thunder of snapping branches. The hunter didn't give chase. He simply lowered his rifle, exhaled slowly through his nose, and listened. The hunt hadn't ended. It had transformed. Retracing his path with silent steps, his sharp eyes scanned for fresh sign. The dense timber suddenly opened into a sunlit clearing, the meadow grass glowing amber in the late afternoon light. He became shadow itself, moccasins brushing the earth like whispers as he slipped behind a fallen log to wait. The herd materialized from the trees, first the watchful cows, then the bull emerging last, its massive shoulders and regal antlers moving through the sea of grass. The hawken found its anchor. One controlled breath, silence. Then, boom! The shot echoed through the valley. The bull staggered, its powerful legs folding gracefully before collapsing. As the herd scattered, the hunter remained motionless, listening intently before approaching his prize. Kneeling beside the fallen giant, he paid his respects. This meat would sustain him. This hide would ward off winter's bite. His green river knife flashed in the fading light as he began the sacred ritual of butchering, from sternum to throat. One fluid, practiced motion. No wasted movement. His skilled hands worked methodically, separating hide from muscle with precision born of necessity. Steam rose from the warm carcass as the pelt peeled away in crimson sheets, carefully set aside for tanning. The chest cavity yielded its treasures, liver and heart wrapped in clean muslin, while the rest would serve as bait for other forest dwellers. Prime cuts, shoulders, hindquarters, back straps were meticulously removed, trimmed, and packed into the parfleche. The rawhide container demanded perfect balance lest its weight tear his shoulders on the trek home. Bones and offal remained, nature's offering to the scavengers. Foxes, ravens, perhaps even a bear would feast tonight beneath the stars. Shouldering his heavy burden, he paused to survey the clearing. The forest blazed with autumn's fire as his moccasins left faint impressions in the rain-softened earth. His foraging eyes spotted a cluster of serviceberries, plump blue jewels bursting with tart sweetness. He harvested sparingly, recalling Blackfoot recipes that combined them with fat and dried meat, precious winter provisions. This ancient knowledge lived through hands that still practiced it. Further along, his nose led him to wild onions, their pungent aroma cutting through the woodland scents. At the meadow's edge, he carefully excavated the bulbs, gathering just enough to flavor stews or combat fever. These weren't his discoveries, but legacies passed down through generations of wilderness dwellers. The cabin welcomed him as twilight deepened. Door barred, gear stowed, he began the evening rituals, berries spread to dry, onions rinsed and diced. While the beaver tail awaited tomorrow's preparation, the elk demanded immediate attention, some for drying, some for smoking, some for tonight's humble stew. A simple meal took form in the blackened pot, wild onions, a handful of berries, and fresh elk simmering together. The rich aroma mingled with wood smoke as he turned to his weapons. His hawken, that trusted .50 caliber companion, received reverent care. A bare-oiled patch smoothed the bore. The lock mechanism clicked clean, the flash channel cleared with a brass pick. His older flintlock received equal attention. Frizzen polished, touch hole cleared, flint sharpened to a keen edge. Only then did he tend to his own wounds. Bear grease and balsam sap stung his cracked knuckles, the pungent salve keeping infection at bay. A glance confirmed the woodpile stood ample, yesterday's foresight paying dividends tonight. At last, he settled by the fire, stew bowl in hand. The tender meat, caramelized onions, and berries reduced to a tangy glaze made each spoonful a reward for the day's labor. Cherry bark tea cut through his fatigue, its bitterness a small price for warmth and cleansing. Outside, the night chorus began. Insects buzzing, an owl's distant query, the wind sighing through pines. A coyote's lament rose and fell in the darkness. He listened without looking, understanding these sounds not as music, but as vital intelligence. In this world, peace never meant rest. Silence was simply nature holding its breath before the next challenge. With rifles cleaned, body tended, and larder stocked, the mountain man leaned back against the rough-hewn logs, firelight dancing in his watchful eyes. Tomorrow would come soon enough. For now there was only this moment, the crackling hearth, the weight of his weapons within reach, and the endless whisper of the wild beyond his door.